Hi everyone, and welcome to the next installment in the series on Nimzowicz's My System. We will carry on now with chapter 3, which deals with the 7th and 8th ranks, which of course, as from White's perspective, are these two here and here. He begins with an introduction to the ideas by reaffirming his thoughts from chapter 2, i.e. occupying the 7th and 8th ranks is a logical result of play down a file, and stresses that his previous examples were rare cases where the defending side had blundered, and that usually it's not possible to occupy the said ranks until the later stages of the game. However, and despite this, he affirms that one should always try to occupy these ranks as quickly as possible, even if at first it appears one's rooks are not doing anything useful there. He follows this up by making the point that, whenever possible, one should have a specific object of attack in such operations. It is characteristic of amateur players that they flounder about from left to right, without a clear plan or goal. Of course, this should always be avoided, and the purpose should be identified before any operation is begun. Usually this will be a pawn to be attacked, or just a square that you want to occupy. Let's take a look at the position before us here. By playing rook d7 immediately, occupying the 7th rank, White does so with an instant object of attack in mind, the c7 pawn. So the move comes with tempo, which is always a good thing. After rook c8, the attackers and defenders on the pawn balance out, and so White can begin similar procedures to that which we saw in the last chapter, i.e. to somehow disrupt the rook's defense, most probably in this position by marching his king up the board to the c6 square. And if, for example, White had a bishop on f2 here, and Black had a knight on g6, White could play bishop g3 to further attack this pawn, and if it moves, then the a7 pawn is dropping. And if the bishop was on f1 instead, then bishop a6 would be the move to eliminate the defender and win material. We can take a look at a similar position, and here White is the exchange up for a pawn, and if our chosen point of attack is c7, then one logical way to continue would be via rook 1 to d4 and then to c4, just adding more pressure to c7. But there's another more forcing and direct approach, which is rook d8 check, forcing rook takes d8, and now rook takes d8, and knight f8. If king f7, then rook d7 check wins the c pawn. But now we can simply play rook c8, and after c5, rook c7, returning to the 7th rank with a new target, the a7 pawn, and new ideas such as limiting the activity of the black king. It can't come out and join into the game. So next, and in this position it's Black to play, and White's doing very well. He's doubled rooks on the 7th, and he wants to attack h7, and he's threatening a quick mate with rook h7 check, king g8, rook g8 check, king f8, and then knight f5. He's going to protect the rook on g7 and threaten rook h8 mate. And it's important to note that in this instance the point of attack is a square rather than a pawn, which is almost always just as effective. Despite not winning material, the possession of the square and the the positional grip it provides is often more important than material. So in order to stop this attack, let's say Black plays rook h6. So now comes knight f5, sorry, and the rook is tied to defending h7 now, so it has to go to h5. And now comes a strong reply from White. If If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. G4 simply is the move. It's very effective because it forces the black rook from the H file. After rook takes H3 check, king G2, and black's going to lose material, and subsequently the game, the rook will be lost here. And for example, if he plays rook takes B3, then white's goal has been achieved. Rook H7 check, king G8, rook CG7 check, king F8, rook H8 is mate. And Nimzowitsch felt that these examples illustrated some of the significant factors of convergent attacks against targets on the 7th rank, both squares and pawns. By convergent he means the focusing of forces together on a certain area or square, as we saw earlier in the series from the first 2 chapters. Before moving on to the next type of attack, the revolutionary, Nimzowitsch was certain to make one more salient point, that being that if the target of attack flees, it should be attacked from behind as opposed to the side. This is of course if it's a pawn or a piece. For example, if a rook on the 7th rank is attacking a pawn on b7 and the pawn moves to b5, the correct move to continue harassing it would be rook b7, as opposed to a sideways attack from the 5th rank with rook c5. Or or just, well, it depends which square the rook's on, but moving to the 5th rank to attack it from the side. And the reasoning behind this is that it's best to keep the rook on the 7th rank as long as possible, as there's a good chance that new targets will appear. Secondly, the flanking maneuver with the rook b7 after the pawn moves is the strongest form of attack, attacking from behind, followed by from the side, and lastly from the front, which of course is the easiest for pawns to defend it against. The final point he makes is that we should always seek to compel our opponents into cramped attempts at defense. To use the same example, if we attack a pawn on b5 from the side, then we might, for instance, allow our opponents the tenacious defense rook b8, which isn't going to be possible if our rook is on b7. Okay, so here's another position. Take a moment and try and figure out the strongest move for white. The question that needs to be asked here is, which square is the correct one to attack? G7 can be targeted, for example via knight G3, but this allows A3. The passed pawns here for black are very menacing. White can continue with knight F5, attacking G7. This allows A2, and if now queen E5, threatening rook takes G7, which is going to lead to mate, black can answer with simply queening, and G7 is protected by the queen, and the attack fails. Black will win easily from here. Instead of this, white needs to think in more forcing terms. G7 was the wrong square to attack. H7, on the other hand, was decisive. If we return to the starting position, the correct move is knight F6 check, and this is going to force mate no matter how black responds. G takes F6 is the best way to delay the mate for as long as possible. If instead king H8, now queen takes H6 check, very strong, forces G takes H6, and now rook H7 is mate. So G takes F6 is preferable. And now white continues with queen E6 check, forcing king H8, and now queen takes F6 check with mate to follow quickly on H7. And this example shows what Nimzowitsch called the revolutionary attack on the 7th rank. One pawn is forced out of the way in order to extend the attacking power of the rook on the 7th rank. In this case to h7, which is the square white had intended to attack from the beginning. Here's another example. Again, if you want to try and find the best move, then stop the video now. Rook takes g7 check. It's the strongest move. Again, white uses the revolutionary attack to stretch out his play along the 7th rank. As before, h7, where the queen has pressure, is the object of attack. This is going to force mate in 5 moves. King takes g7 is best. If instead king f8, then queen takes h7 and the mate is forced even more quickly. So king takes g7, and now rook c7 check, king f8, queen h6 check is the most accurate. Queen takes h7 also forces mate, but queen h6 check advances the queen with gain of tempo as follows. King e8, king g8 obviously is just mate straight away. So king 8, queen e3 check, king f8, queen e7 check, and white gains the 7th rank for his rook and queen decisively. And he does so with an acoustic echo. That's what Nimzowitch calls gaining the positional advantage with tempo, and here with check as well. So now comes only move king g8, and now queen g7 is mate. And Nimzowitch felt this last maneuver was worthy of some further explanation. So take a look at this position, and if you want to try and spot the best move, again please stop the video now. The only move for white is queen g4 check, and the reasoning behind this is that white needs to pick up the knight on h1 with check, or he will find himself at a disadvantage. Of course he can't capture it straight away, or black plays rook a1 check, king g2, rook takes h1 with an easy win. And the point of queen g4 is that after king h8 it doesn't make any difference if the king goes to h7 instead. Next comes queen h3 check, king g7 or g8, queen g2 check, king h8, queen takes h1 check, and white captures with check, which is done by driving the king to the appropriate square before capturing. And with this continuation, of course, there's no rook a1 check, and white will have favourable chances from here on in. Here's a slightly trickier one. Again, if you want to try and find the best move, then stop the video now. The square to be taken with check is e7, after which white will have a forcing mate, and from this position it's mate in 4, but only with the correct first move. And white has to be very careful. If he gives the wrong check, for example with queen h4 hoping for queen h6 check, or with a queen f2 check and king e8, queen takes c5 with a mate on e7 threatened next, black can answer with e3 check from the bishop, and this is lethal because of the threat of rook a1 check, and suddenly it's white who will get mated instead. So obviously this approach is wrong. Of course the correct move is queen f1 check, because what this does is after king e8 it allows queen b5 with check, and king f8 is best, king d8 is the only other legal move, queen d7 is mate. So king f8, and now queen takes c5 is check, and you know, again the check forces king e8, and now queen e7 is mate, and there's no sneaky counter attack for black. and the target square is achieved. And the key point of the procedure is that white takes on c5 with check, i.e. after queen b5 check, white is in contact with both c5 and the black king, which is being forced onto a square that is also in contact with c5. Simple and straightforward, but it's difficult to master. Okay, that's the end of part 1.